Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Dr. Christopher John Hunt, who is the Senior Clinical Supervisor at the University of Sydney's Gamble Aware Clinics, which are responsible for coordinating government-funded gambling treatment throughout Sydney. Dr. Hunt first began work at the university in the then titled Gambling Treatment Clinic in early 2007. Since then, he has gained wide recognition for his work with problem gamblers. He has published work on clinical phenomena observed in gambling clients, has been asked to testify before both federal and state parliamentary committees on gambling, has been extensively quoted on gambling in local, national and international media, and has written several pieces on gambling for lay audiences. He is also responsible for coordinating clinical supervision to psychologists and counsellors who are working in the gambling field throughout Sydney, and organises training seminars for mental health practitioners working in the field of problem gambling and information seminars for the general public. Dr. Hunt has kindly come on today's episode to talk about gambling treatment and clinical phenomena observed in gambling clients. And I think you're going to really enjoy this one, because I certainly have. I was able to not only learn an immense amount in this field, in this space of gambling, but also this struggle that I could observe in myself of trying to fit in this gambling behavior with other theories and models in psychology. There's this bias that I'm really trying to cling on to of saying, how does this fit? How does this work? How can I understand this? And even watching that bias in myself working was fascinating, because it almost speaks to how sometimes people with problem gambling can themselves get entangled in thought and get into a theory of winning and how today's opportunity to win money might just be the day. So fascinating, certainly for me, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did speaking with Dr. Christopher John Hunt. Chris, a big thank you for coming onto the show today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you about, all things gambling and particularly from someone who's gone out and looked at this, more scientific nature. Gambling, something that so many of us feel that we have somewhat of a handle on understanding, but I know there's always intricacies in all spaces, and looking forward to hearing about that side of things, particularly with some of the phenomena that's been observed in the sort of gambling clients. So let me just get started. How did you fall into this space? This interest?
Well, I guess when I was at university, as well as psychology, I was really interested in maths and the philosophy of science, and in some ways working in the gambling space is something that sort of combines all of those sort of areas. So as a clinician, understanding concepts such as randomness, probability, things like that comes in really handy working in a gambling treatment space. And on top of that, just sort of a lot of philosophical questions about control, a deterministic universe. This all sounds very highbrow, but essentially those sort of philosophical ideas really play a lot into working with problem gambling. So I think it's an interesting area that combines a lot of different interests, as well as a lot of societal issue. So it is, in Australia at least, as well as in many other places around the world, an issue that touches many different aspects of civil society. So it's at the nexus of a whole bunch of different things.
It's really interesting space in that many of us get have an understanding about the probabilities, and hence why for most, gambling or at least problematic gambling is not an issue. But it is quite interesting to think about what is someone's, mind or perception of what gambling looks like when it is problematic, because it seems like there is, for lack of a better word, almost magical thinking that's going on. And, that's probably not the right language, but there can be things that are, on the edge of things, like, people picking a certain slot machine that, is the lucky one, that they've had success there before. And, they might even wait for someone to get off a machine after a certain period of time because, now it's going to be, I'm going to strike luck at this point.
Yeah, but I think I'd say two things there. And one thing I would like to correct you on is the idea that most people understand concepts like randomness and probability. And that's actually very much demonstrably incorrect, is that the greater majority of the population actually don't understand these concepts particularly well. Randomness in particular, I think when they've done research work, it's, up to 90% of the population do understand it incorrectly. So first of all, that is incorrect to sort of assume that problem gamblers have a different understanding of these concepts than the general public. Obviously, they do develop very specific cognitions around how gambling works, but they're not necessarily, as you described, them, magical thinking. Sometimes they are perfectly reasonable ways of thinking that something might work. And they traditionally are based on ways that other things work. But it's just that there are very few things in the real world that are random. I mean, if you try and think of an example, it's not tied to either gambling or, some other sort of game. It's very hard because, most random things in our world are usually developed for gambling. So things like dice or roulette wheels or lotto balls or things like that. There's very, very few natural things that are random. So it makes sense that most of the population do actually struggle with this concept. So that's not the reason why someone develops a gambling problem. Obviously, it's a contributing component, but it's not all there is to it. And it's more that what we think is more important is someone's early experiences with gambling, and such that people who go on to gamble, and particularly those that gamble heavily, tend to have early positive experiences with gambling, whereas those who are more dismissive of gambling tend to have negative early experiences with gambling. So that seems to be more important than a general understanding of randomness and probability. That said,
can you just jump in? If I can just jump in, can you tell us a little bit about how we do understand, or the most sort of average person, don't know who that is, but an average person understands randomness? Is that sort of space where obviously it's been beaten into probably both of us, that correlation doesn't equal causation. And so that sort of scientific mind looks at it, and maybe that's where my filter comes from, that I look at it quite regularly. And so maybe that's my attribution of saying others probably look at it through my own lens as well. But randomness is not something that people have a good hold of.
Yeah.
Or probability, my apologies, is probably a better word, because randomness.
Yeah, well, they're actually two separate. Randomness and probability are two separate concepts that are related but not the same thing. And so they're two very distinct ideas. So randomness, essentially, how most people understand the word randomness is that something's unpredictable. And whilst unpredictability is an element of randomness, it's not what defines randomness. And part of that is, in our colloquial speech, we use the word random incorrectly quite frequently. So when we say things like the weather is random or, the buses come at random, neither of those phenomena are random, but it's just a person's way of saying, well, something's unpredictable. And so when people hear something like, oh, a poker machine's random, they think about it within that context of a word that's rarely used in its proper strict statistical sense. And so it's not unreasonable that people do have misconceptions about what that word actually means in this context. So what the word random means is, strictly speaking, it's we're talking about independence of turns, that previous outcomes give no useful information about what future outcomes will be. That's essentially what the word is really getting at. But people take it to mean just generally, a sense of unpredictability, or some people even use it to mean something's changing constantly, which isn't necessarily a random phenomena. So there are various ways of understanding that word, which when someone says to you, oh, a poker machine's random, a roulette wheel's random, lotto balls are random, people might say, oh yeah, I know that, but because that word random is used in such a loose way in our everyday speech, it makes sense that people don't fully comprehend what that means when it's referring to something like a poker machine. And with probability, I think the main misconception with probability is the idea that when we're talking about expected outcomes or probabilities, that it means that that if something is diverging from that, then therefore it somehow has to balance out. So for example, if you have 4 heads in a row when we know it's got to be 50-50 heads tails, that means that tails have got to come soon, which is not what probability is about at all. But it makes sense that people have that conception because of the way that these terms are talked about.
And having a better understanding of concepts like a regression to the mean versus on a single turn what something might be. So if you have, 100,000 turns of in any given probabilities, they begin to even out the more you do. So if you do 200,000, 500,000, a million, versus if you just do 5 of those, you can see a great skew in one. But if you increase the numbers, then you're likely to have some sort of regression to the mean.
To an extent, but I think both the phrases regression to the mean and the other word the phrase that you threw out was even out. And that's the language that people use for describing this, but that in itself can be misleading, because it sort of implies that if something happens one way, then it has to go the other way to sort of balance it out. And that's actually not strictly true when we're talking about regression towards the mean. What it sort of means is that over a huge number of turns, so if we're talking about, as you say, 5 turns versus a million turns, it's not so much that it has to even out at some point. It means that in the scale of a million turns, that 5 heads in a row just doesn't matter anymore. So it's more of an issue of scale as opposed to something having to even out at some point. And I think even though that wasn't what you were getting at when you were saying that, but that sort of language is part of where some of these misconceptions come from.
And maybe that's also why it's so hard for us to understand probabilities very well, because even the language and the meaning around what these things are is hard to get a grasp on, because we can talk about it in a short term or a longer term, and how we view these things is interesting, because 5 tails in a row, for most people they're going to say, oh look, it's got to fall on the next one to be, or at least the probability is higher that it's now going to be a heads. And it kind of sounds very reasonable, but we're kind of just flipping an individual flip at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes back to what I was saying before, in that there's very few things in the real world that demonstrate this principle. So it's sort of, in one of the examples I used earlier about the idea that the buses come at random. So yes, it's sometimes true that the buses are unreliable and that they don't follow the set schedule. But at the same time, we do know that the longer you're standing at a bus stop, eventually one of them is going to show up. And that's how things tend to work in the real world. But when we're dealing with, devices that were specifically designed not to follow that principle, it sort of makes sense that all sorts of beliefs come up, including these sort of very shorthand beliefs that, it's got to come up eventually. Even though that's not true in a statistical sense, or in a practical sense, if we're talking about gambling, it makes sense why someone would think that.
Yeah. And I think that's probably where I applied that language of magical thinking. Obviously not the right term, but where we can, put things together that correlate, and somehow connect them together as though there's a causation. So I don't know if that whole scenario of if you can hear crickets, it's the crickets that bring the moon out, because the moon only comes out when there's crickets, and round and round we go. But it is interesting to hear that the early positive experiences is a huge factor in this. I've always thought, because I am fairly extreme in a lot of things that I do, and I had one gambling experience, and I've always felt that I was blessed because I lost all of my funds at the time in one big foul swoop. It was the first time I gambled, and it was kind of like the last as well. And I always thought, wow, if I had hit jackpot just completely, through sheer luck, it could have been a different story. At least for a period of time, I assume it could have probably, swung the wrong way. But tell me a little bit more about that positive versus negative early experiences.
Yeah. So it's one of the things that we see in pretty much all of the clients we do see with gambling harm, is that they did experience, they did have an early positive experience when they first encountered here's where I'll be specific, their preferred form of gambling. So before I get into that early experience, I will point out that most people who experience gambling related harm will gamble on one form preferentially. And I'll get why that's important in a second, because it relates to this early positive experience. But most people who, for example, play slot machines won't necessarily, say, play casino games or bet on the horses, and vice versa. Some people who bet on the horses can be quite dismissive towards slot machines in particular, and so on and so forth. So the stereotype of someone who has a gambling problem being someone who will bet on two flies walking up the wall or just bet on anything is actually not what we see with the vast majority of the clients we see. And that's because what seems to be a sort of factor in how someone develops harm with gambling is that they have this early positive experience with their preferred form of gambling. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a big win. It doesn't necessarily mean that you go in with $10 and win 10 grand or something like that. It just has to be something that's meaningful for you at that point in your life. So it could be that, the stereotypical example is it's your 18th birthday, so your mates take you to the pub, you put $10 on a horse, you win $40, and you buy a round of drinks for everyone. That's the sort of stereotypical example. It could be something more like someone's going through a messy divorce and they go meet a friend at the pub, but the friend's running late, so they decide to put $10 in the poker machine while they're waiting, and they have a few small wins. So something that $10 that should have lasted 10 minutes ends up lasting half an hour or an hour, and they're forgetting about their trouble because they're focused on making that money last as long as they can, and they're getting enough wins to get them there. That could be it. So it's not necessarily about this big windfall, but it's just generally about having this positive experience, being up, having some winnings that you have positive meaning attached to in that early experience.
Can it exclude the win? For example, someone where they, after a difficult separation, they're gambling with a friend, and the connection that they have with the friend while they still lose their funds. So they put $100 in or $50 in, whatever the number is, and they lose it without any exciting like highs and lows. It's just like, we were losing, but it was a fun night because, I let my hair down, had a couple of beers with a friend and gambled.
That's rarer
And does it
because
usually
usually
have
that
some excitement to
yeah,
it,
there has to be
a little
some
bit of boredom?
excitement. There has to be some excitement tied to the machine. So even if they lost it eventually, there has to be some wins along the way because that's what
Yeah,
gives the excitement. If you go to a poker machine, put I don't know $20 in, and every time you push the button you lose, that's not exciting at all. So that's not fun. The fun, yes, there might be fun around it, but then that would attach to the things going on around it. So there has to be some sort of excitement that comes from that frizz, so to
thrill.
speak, that
There's a
comes from
thrill of the
being,
win that you're up a little bit. Oh, now we're back
yeah,
again. Oh, we've
yeah,
won a couple of dollars. Oh, we're down 10 again. But so long as there's kind of some sort of enjoyment of the up process.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily about the money per se. Obviously sometimes it is. Sometimes if you were someone that put in $10 and won, I don't know, 8 grand, 9 grand, I would assume that yes, that is about the money. But sometimes it is more about the excitement, the thrill, the fun that comes with that up. It comes with the up. The down is not exciting or thrilling or fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it doesn't come with that. It comes from, as you say, the up.
Almost like if someone's watching sports and then your team is up and it's very exciting, but then your team can be down as well, and you lose the match at the end, but it was still enjoyable. Would have been nicer if you'd won, but it was fun while you're up.
Exactly. As opposed to, if you go and watch your team and they just get hammered from the start, that's not fun to watch.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Which is probably that negative experience that I had
Yeah.
was going in and as a very, very young man losing 2 or 3 weeks worth of
Yeah.
employments, or wages, in record
Yeah.
time.
So I think
Alone,
and what you're
alone.
describing is something very similar to, because I've also had a lot of experience providing counseling to family and family members who have been affected by a partner's gambling or a parent's gambling or child's gambling or whatnot. And they say something very similar to what you say. And it's almost like a cognitive, because they've had that negative positive experience, they go on to develop negative attitudes towards gambling. So they don't necessarily attribute it to that negative early experience, but it's almost like you have that negative experience and then it's almost like you develop a set of beliefs
Narrative.
that sort of go with it. So it's like, I don't know, the example I use with my clients a lot is, imagine someone the first time you meet them and they're absolutely horrible. They're really nasty to you. They're cranky. They're just quite an unpleasant person to be around. And then you meet them multiple times after that, and even though they might be completely lovely every time you've met them afterwards, you're likely to harbor that sort of slightly negative feeling about them from that first experience. And what that gets to is that first experiences are lasting, and they tend to have a disproportionate large effect on our attitudes towards a person or an activity. And it's not necessarily that we're able to logically sit down and say, well, I've had this many positive experiences with someone or this many negative experiences and it should up this way. There's always a disproportionate weight to those first experiences. And that's true of gambling as much as it's true of when we interact with people. So, you've had a negative experience early on. Even if you'd had small positive experiences after that, you're likely to retain that negative attitude towards gambling for a while. And similarly, someone who develops gambling harm is likely to have had an early positive experience. And even if you were to add up the sums, you would say, yes, they probably had more negative experiences than positive experiences over their lifetime. That early experience has a disproportionate weight.
I was actually having this conversation last night with one of the colleagues leaving the office, and we're talking about drug taking and that kind of first experience of for example, heroin, and the concept of chasing the red dragon, how it would be almost impossible to actually replicate the first experience, because when you have never had a reference to that first experience, the distance between the two is so significant, and to then try and actually reach that, I don't know if we can even do that, chemically, that the first time, like a child, tastes something sweet, the deviation is so significant. And it must encode. There must be something that goes on that you know, makes it so powerful that we can then kind of not see the other stuff, or it waters down the other stuff, because we know how sweet that first experience, you know, was, or how enjoyable, or whatever it did for us. The dopamine that you know, potentially provided must be so unique, you know, in that first experience.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I think in terms of phrasing it that way, I think there's separate elements when we're talking about drugs and alcohol, because part of the reason why it's difficult to get that effect again is sort of the developments of tolerance and things like that. But when we're talking about gambling, or even anything, that idea about first experiences, it's not something that's specific to gambling or drugs or things of that nature. It's something that's just generally true. It's something about our learning, is that you know, there's multiple studies on principles of learning, that there's a disproportionate weight given to early experiences with anything, whether it's positive or negative, and whether it's something like, you know, drugs, alcohol, and gambling, or even something really innocuous like you know, your first experience going to school, your first experience riding a horse, your first experience riding a bike. You know, it's not it's
first experiences. Yeah.
it's
It's
just
almost
something
like a
about first
post-traumatic
experience
stress can come in that space as well, where something of a high emotional richness, you know, that's quite significant, and doesn't matter what it sticks to. It could be, you know, as you say, any of those items, which can be quite, you know, insignificant, but they are powerful because we continue to remember them.
Yeah, I think it's similar, but yeah, it's a similar process to that, but it's a little bit different. But it's more, as I said, it's more about the emotional attachment than necessarily about the size of the win per se, that sort of, when we're talking about these early positive experiences. So and I think what's interesting about gambling is it's we're talking about a positive experience rather than negative experience. So you know, if we're talking about something like PTSD, there's evidence that there's different ways in which the mind reacts to things that are fearful that we should then avoid in the future. Whereas if we're talking about gambling, we're talking about something that you're training it to be an appetitive stimulus, something to approach. So the processes are slightly different, but I guess it's a similar idea in theory.
No, that's a good point. One, yeah, that fear response, yeah, most definitely is very different to a, you know, lean into response that, you know, is attractive, you know, from a pleasure point of view. So early positive experiences, how does that tend, you know, from your experience, lead to, you know, the gambling related harm? Are there particular attributes that people, because obviously there's plenty of people who've had a first positive experience, but it hasn't developed into that, and that would be true with everything. But
absolutely.
You know, what are the type of characteristics that are there characteristics that tend to come with that? Is there a, you know, sort of, I don't know, stereotypical thing around impulsivity or something?
Well,
you know, where does it lie?
People with high levels of impulsivity are more likely to develop gambling problems, but it's neither necessary or sufficient. So in terms of who goes on to develop, yes, you are 100% right. Not everyone that has an early positive experience goes on to develop, you know, gambling harm or significant gambling harm. That's absolutely true. But it does come back to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, in that usually what happens is, if people for whatever reason get into a pattern of regular play, usually what then happens is a system of beliefs will build up that we call a theory of winning, that my colleague, Dr. Fadi Anjul, he coined the term, actually, a theory of winning. So it's basically a set of beliefs will develop about how your preferred form of gambling works. And those beliefs, even though everyone has these sort of particular unique elements of the system of beliefs they come up, they tend to have common elements to them. So with poker machines, it's usually about this idea that they pay in some sort of cycle, where they alternate between cycles where they're taking in money and taking money out. If we're talking about casino table games like roulette or baccarat or things like that, it's usually that there's some sort of system that you can use to, you know, beat the house. And if we're talking about wagering, so horses and sports, it's usually some sort of idea that I can use my knowledge through trial and error to come up with a system that's going to lead me to beat the system. You know, that's done in very, you know, quick grabs of what sometimes can be quite elaborate systems of belief. But essentially, that seems to be the more necessary component, is after that early positive experience, someone who, whether deliberately or acts or just through, gambling a lot more, goes on to develop these system of beliefs which encourages continuous play. And that seems to be more of what's going on. We don't know why one person might develop it or not. It might just be sort of unpredictable factors, like someone just had more time to go gambling a lot in their initial period, or they're in a social environment that encouraged continued gambling. It could be something psychological going on in terms of what's going on in their life. There's all sorts of things that we're not quite sure what that is, but we do know that it's, that this early positive experience followed by that development of beliefs. The other thing that's interesting is what changes is that it changes over time. So that focus on being up becomes more important as you go along. So both within a gambling session and across your sort of gambling career, so to speak, for want of a better word. And so what I would mean by that is, if we think about it within a session, it's something I like to call the monopoly principle. So if you think out, like imagine that you're at home with your family and it's a rainy day and I don't know, the internet's out. And so you decide, oh, why don't we sit down as a family and play a game of Monopoly? At that time, your motivation for playing the game is maybe you're bored and want something a bit exciting. Maybe you want to do something that's bonding with your family. Maybe you want something that's an escape from, thinking about whatever's in your mind. There's a whole host of reasons why you could decide to get that board game out of the cupboard and play with your family. But once you start playing, once you start rolling the dice, and I'll ask you personally, what becomes the main motivation once you start rolling that dice?
Well, it used to be when I was younger, winning. Now it's actually about losing because I'm playing with my daughters. But you have to kind of balance it there. You don't want to have too many tears. No, absolutely. I think you start really honing in on trying to win. Yeah,
absolutely. And the longer you play the game, the more sort of important that becomes, and the more people start to do dodgy things like stealing money from the bank to get there, and that's it. It's like a gambling session's the same. The reason why someone might go and sit in front of the poker machines at a club or might go to their local tab or racetrack might be varied. It might be because they're bored. It might be because they're trying to avoid thinking about something. It might be that, they want to do something with their mates who are down at the pub that day and they just happen to start gambling. But once you're in front of that machine, once you start putting that first bet on, the win becomes more and more important the longer you're sitting there for. And you see a similar process play out over someone's, as I said, for want of a better word, career of gambling. So when you first start gambling, it's usually something that's done social. You do it with your friends. You might do it just occasionally. It might be relatively small amounts of money. But as the sums start to get larger, as debt starts to grow, as you start to fall behind on payments, those sort of winning motives become more and more central as you go along, because it goes from, I want to play, but wouldn't it be nice to win, to wanting to win, to going to a point where you need to win. If I don't win today, I can't pay my electricity bill. If I don't win today, I can't pay back so-and-so. If I don't win today, my wife's going to find out I gamble and I'm going to be in big trouble. So it's that shift from wanting to win to needing to win. And so it's in both cases where we're talking about in the short time frame of a gambling session or a longer time frame of across someone's lifetime of gambling, the win becomes more important the longer you're there for.
And I'm assuming as well that the longer you're in it, that the more opportunity you have, or the more time that you have to develop these beliefs, this theory of winning as well. So, rather than calling it magical thinking, that the truth is there is a rationality to this, and if you talk to someone who has gambling difficulties, they can lay out the reasons how they're going to beat the house, so to speak, or so long as A, B, C, and D, and even though it might break down somewhere, it still seems very logical in terms of that it's methodical. Might not be right, but it's methodical, and they've spent so much time in it that the belief is strong. And I've just got to get this to happen, and then I'll be able to pay everyone off, or whatever stereotypical thing I can say.
Absolutely, I think that's exactly right. It's not necessarily, and I guess maybe this is why I picked up with your use of that term originally. It's not necessarily magical thinking, because the theories are not sort of bizarre beliefs. It's just that it's more that they use a logic to it, and there's a reasoning behind it. It's just that there's usually at least one false premise in there that means that the whole thing falls down. If we're talking about horses, sports, other forms of racing, and casino table games, it is very explicit, like in that way that you're describing there. Sometimes with poker machines, it's less, the theories are there, but they're less explicit, but they're definitely there driving the behavior, but people are less able to put them into words. They tend to be more of a vague sense that if I do this, this will happen. The underlying thoughts are there, and sometimes part of doing counseling, doing therapy is about helping people pull those thoughts out. But they tend to be less on the surface in the way you described than what you would see in, say, someone that's betting on the horses.
Is there any element, and I'm going to try and, sorry, I might mix things up a bit here, but I want to hear your thoughts with this. Is there an element that the two spaces can relate, where the phenomena around when you're, let's call it obsessive around gambling, and naturally there's a yearning to get to a club, TAB, or whatever it might be. It's not necessarily a compulsion per se, but I know that with the obsessive compulsive space, that sometimes what we're doing is simply trying to remove the discomfort that if I do X, flick the switch 6-7 times, or do this many times, that I'm kind of trying to base it on a feeling. If I need to get to a certain feeling to get this right. Is there ever a time where I am feeling which bet is the right bet that plays into any of this, or am I just kind of clutching at straws? It just feels like there might be something between those. And obviously you speak with a lot of clients, and I haven't in my time that about how someone, because there's a methodology, but we can't always articulate it, right? Like, so someone can understand, someone knows why they're betting on a particular horse, for example. But it's going to be very, very hard for them to actually say, I actually know all the statistical stuff from the last 35 races, because usually we're not bookies.
Okay, I'll say usually, but some of them do try and use that level of detail, but most of the time not. But look, what I would say to that as a general comment is, to start off with, is firstly, similarities between gambling problems and OCD have been, which I'm guessing is what you're getting at with the words you're using there, have been theorized for a very long time. And there definitely is elevated rates of OCD in people with a gambling problem and vice versa. So there are similar processes. I think there's a couple of differences. One is, with OCD, the emotional reactions that are sort of prompted tend to be more on the sort of either usually with disgust or with a fear side of things, which is less something that seems to be a driver of gambling behavior, at least in the way you're describing. But I guess the other thing is where they sort of, I guess, differ, is that OCD is often very focused on there's going to be some terrible outcome if I don't go through with this compulsive behavior. Whereas with gambling, the idea is it's not so much that there's a feared negative outcome if I don't engage in this behavior. It's more that there's a sort of a focus on the possibility that this is going to work out in my favor and ignoring the probability that it's not. So as I said, it's not necessarily about the money. It can be, one might say, yes, it might be about the money that someone focuses on. Well, if this horse wins, then if I put $20 on it, it's playing 5 to 1, I'll get $100. That'll solve my problems. Boom. It can be that. And they're discounting if a horse is 5 to 1, it's probably going to lose. And they're discounting that probability. But sometimes it can also be an emotional focus. So, going back to someone playing the poker machines, it could be, well, I've got $100. If I just go to the pokies, I'll forget about my problems. I'll be able to relax. I'll be able to sort of be by myself for a while. And they're discounting what's probably going to happen, which is, one, they'll go over their limit. They'll end up feeling worse than when they went in. They'll feel guilty. They'll feel ashamed. They're sort of discounting that sort of negative probable outcome. So it's more, it's a similar process to OCD, but there's different sort of mechanisms at play, if that makes sense.
It is interesting because, I mean, I didn't necessarily know the connection that OCD has some correlation with problem gambling, but there is potentially, talking this through is, if I had a problem with gambling, I might be feeling more and more angst in this podcast because I can't wait to get to, be able to gamble. And so as that builds, there's a relief that comes about from being able to, gamble. And so the obsession of, I want to gamble, whether it's about the win or, most likely as you mentioned, for long-term problem gambling. And then there's kind of a relief of, I've got there, and I don't feel that discomfort anymore.
I think what's different is that, the relief with gambling doesn't come with the behavior. So if that was it, then just putting the bet on would cause the relief, and that's not what happens. The relief comes from putting the bet on, and if the bet gets up. So it's different from OCD, where there's a relief that comes from engaging in the behavior itself.
Wouldn't the relief come from, sorry to jump in, Chris, well, wouldn't the relief come from just the opportunity?
No, the absolute
putting
opposite.
The bet on.
The absolute opposite.
The opposite, is it?
So what we saw and this is something that we saw quite clearly with the pandemic, is that when people are prevented from gambling, such as when venues are shut or they run out of money, that's when they experience relief. So it's actually so it's almost the opposite. So no, that's definitely not what we saw and what we see clinically.
I'm a bit confused because my thought would have been, this is so fascinating. My thought would have been that there would be if I were to go out and say, where are your suds, pre-gambling, you're at home, but you can't get out and you want to be, you're getting more and more agitated. And then when you're given the opportunity, because you're no longer in a meeting or whatever it might be, you go down to the club and then there's a reduction in your suds. You're like, I'm feeling better. And that's obviously only for that session, that gambling session. So there's kind of a relief, and that relief would be there. Obviously, the angst would probably return 50 minutes later when you've lost your money again. And then your distress is up again. But there was that initial relief. That's an obsessional thing. If I flick the switch 8 times, I do get that relief. But 10 minutes later.
Yeah, and I guess as I was going through that's why that analogy to OCD falls apart, because that's not what gambling looks like at all. It's sort of yes, there sometimes can be an anticipatory sort of boost, but whether or not there's a relief is entirely dependent on whether or not someone wins or not. So there's no relief that comes from putting the bet on. Because if you imagine,
is there a relief to getting to the club?
Not specific, because if you think about it, if someone puts a bet on the horse, they're still in that same sense of anticipation until there's an outcome.
Yeah.
In
Okay.
fact, their anxiety may even go up after they put the bet on until there's an outcome. So it's not the behavior itself that relieves any sort of sensation.
So it's actually connected to the win, not connected to the opportunity.
No, exactly.
That's where I'm getting stuck. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's what makes gambling quite unique, in that it's very different from any other behavior, because in some ways the outcome is, as the colleague I mentioned previously, Fadi Anjul, as he pointed out, is the outcome is bivariate. It's not like a linear thing like you see in OCD or in drugs and alcohol, where anxiety builds, so I engage in this behavior, it takes away my anxiety. Or if we're talking about drugs and alcohol, I'm experiencing withdrawal symptoms until I take the drug. Or if I take more of the drug, it's going to have a larger impact. Gambling doesn't work that way, because every time you put a bet on, you can either win or lose, and the impact that has on you is entirely different. So it's difficult to characterizing it in the same way as these other forms of behavior actually lead you down to tricky paths and to predict things that don't actually come out. So so coming back to what I was saying, if what you were saying is true, then what you would see in the pandemic is that all these gamblers sort of pulling their hair out because they can't put a bet on. But what we actually saw is like, oh, the clubs are shut. That's good. I don't have to think about that for now. And there was a sense of relief.
This is so fascinating. I can see my mind kind of churning over, because I'm trying to package this all together in what I already know, and kind of say, how does this fit with the rest of my kit? There's so many nuances, but it's also interesting, probably to your point as well, is it probably therefore wouldn't also make sense that the reason for it starting is not usually the reason for it maintaining. And so, obviously, in someone continuing that behavior, it becomes something very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think so that's definitely true. The reason why it starts isn't the reason why it continues. And it's more important, I guess, to address the reason why it continues than to address the reason why it starts. So for example, like, lots of people gamble, but the reason why someone comes to see us for help with it isn't because they gamble. It's because once they start, they find it difficult to stop. That's the problem. The problem isn't that they put a bet on in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's that space of how someone wants gambling to feature. Is it something that is done for entertainment and enjoyment versus something that is something that's kind of got a hold of their life, and that they feel like it's a necessity that they have to pay people back, or whatever it might be. Yeah. That it's harmful. It's no longer. It probably started with entertainment, but it isn't anymore.
Absolutely, and it's the same with in that way, it is quite analogous to drugs and alcohol, because they usually start as entertainment as well. Like, no one starts out wanting to be dependent on heroin, or no one starts out wanting to be an alcoholic. No one starts out wanting to be a problem gambler. It's something that slowly develops over time, and you're 100% right. It starts off as something fun, as something exciting, as something often social, and then it develops from there.
And then it entwines with all these, that development of beliefs and that theory of winning, that as we know as clinicians, the belief, even simple belief systems that are extremely straightforward, I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable. So that's a very direct, simple, thing, but a theory of winning can be a lot more elaborate than that.
It can be, but I guess one thing that's good as a psychologist working with theories of winning is, when someone with depression develops thoughts like I'm unlovable or I'm not good enough, you can't objectively challenge those, but the theories of winnings that gamblers develop can objectively be shown to be false. So I think in some ways that's an advantage of working with gamblers, in that a lot of their problematic beliefs are things that are, you can disprove them. But I think, which sometimes can be a challenge for therapists, because I think, you also have to get used to telling people that something they're thinking is just wrong, which sometimes, if you don't do it well as a therapist, can come across as hugely invalidating. So I think finding that balance is a challenge working as a psychologist therapist in this space. But I might, if you don't mind, there's two other things that I probably want to point out, that these things we already talked about, they then also combine with some sort of, I guess, thought patterns and ways of thinking and ways of interacting with the world, which are actually quite common and quite protective most of the time, to result in a relatively poor outcome for people. And so first of all, something like optimism bias, generally, so overestimating the probability that something good will happen and underestimating the probability something bad will happen. Obviously, with someone that's already got these theories of winning developed, that's something that's normally protective for someone's mood actually now becomes something that's somewhat dangerous and encourages continued gambling. The other thing that's problematic is what we call this sort of small picture focus, this sort of focusing on what's going to happen today, what's likely to happen today. Can I leave the venue today being up or down? And obviously, if we're focusing on that small picture, yes, it is possible that you could go gamble today and win and leave up. And often what happens is then people discount their history of gambling and their history of losses and their thousands of dollars they're down, and just focus on, well, can I win today and use that money to do this or pay back my debt or just be in a good mood or whatever. And through that, they're missing the big picture, which is that not only are losses always more likely than wins, but if you look at your losses, you're this far down in the hole and there's no win that you can have at this point that's going to get you out of that sort of small picture focus, which serves people in other areas of their life. So for example, if you have a bad day at work, it doesn't necessarily help you to think about all the other bad days at work and think about how you're doomed to sort of fail going forward. If in those circumstances, being someone that draws a line under your previous bad experiences and focuses on, the potential for positives going forward is helpful, is beneficial, is something that can be quite protective for someone's mood. But for someone that's developed, say, these theories of winning, that sort of focus of drawing a line, oh, today was a bad day, I'm not going to think about it again, I'm just going to move on and try and do better tomorrow. That way of approaching the world, which is generally protective when it comes to gambling, can take you to a bad place.
Well, those two factors must be, quite powerful in this work, because I could just kind of think about the scenario of that optimism bias. 80% of people think they're better than average drivers.
Yeah.
And if your optimism is high and you're short-term focused, that's kind of small picture thinking. It's like, things can go really good today. And I can beat the house. I can win today. And so that pull becomes, quite stronger. And as you say, that big picture thinking is harder to achieve that, because that's probably where, or most likely where, probability thinking might start occur, where that whole concept, and maybe you can correct me here as well, but where that whole concept of, if I start looking at long term, I will actually look at my history and go, well, I didn't win here and I didn't win there. I mean, is that where sometimes sort of keeping a diary can actually be helpful of, so someone can actually notice, observe, and acknowledge, are they up, are they down, and what the trends are?
Absolutely. I mean, and some clients are actually quite resistant when we bring this up, because they don't want to know. But yes, generally speaking, we advocate for all sorts of things of trying to keep accurate records of exactly how much you're losing, because even if people are aware that they're losing more than they're winning, often they still underestimate the degree by how much. And it's quite tricky. But I think, to come back to what we're talking, again, there's a discrepancy between, people that bet on horses and sports, where sometimes they do believe that they're either breaking even or making money when in fact they're losing. and people that bet on slot machines, poker machines, who generally are aware that they're losing more than they win, but they're focusing on more this other aspect of the upside. But it might make me feel better, or I might be able to escape my problems for a while, and then missing the other side of the ledger that no, it makes you feel guilty, it makes you feel ashamed, it makes you feel depressed. And part of the reason, and it's the cause of the problems of your life, it's not actually helping you solve them. And so it's a similar sort of process, but I think with horses and sports and casino table games, there's a more close focus on the money and an imbalance in the thoughts there. Whereas with poker machines, for some people it is a money focus, but for others it is more about an emotional ledger, so to speak.
Something that just came up in my mind that maybe I'm trying to relate things again here, but it raised in my mind even this whole concept, and more and more why I'm kind of stepping away from the magical thinking, for lack of a better term, but thinking about the methodology of thought.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of entrepreneurs go into starting a business not because they want to, have a regular income, but they all want to become the next Uber, the next, Apple or whatever it is. They're going for the jackpot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they overestimate their capacity to make that happen. Because we know that the probabilities just demonstrate that small business owners fail quite considerably. But there's an optimism bias there. Yet they have a plan, a bit of a strategy in their mind as to why their product is, or service or whatever it might be. It's quite fascinating because that optimism of I'm going for being the next Uber, rather than just, I want to do something that's reasonable and average, but a good income. Entrepreneurs are not doing that. They're going.
Yeah. And I think there's an element of that. But I think the thing that I try and point out with, because clients, some clients have raised something similar like that to me. And it's like, it's true for people that do achieve great things, whether it's, setting up the next Uber or, Airbnb or whatever, or, winning a gold medal at the Olympics, or, winning an Oscar, or, all these sorts of really unlikely achievements that do require, that do require both a lot of work and a bit of luck. Yes, sometimes to achieve those things, sometimes you do have to have a similar mindset of, discounting your losses, trying to build focus on, in an almost maniacal way, on trying to achieve something that everyone else says you can't achieve. But I guess how I sort of pointed out to clients is to sort of remind them, but you're dealing with a system, which is commercial gambling, which is set up such that you can't beat it. You can't. You can't beat the casino. You can't beat, a poker machine. It's got nothing to do with you or your skills or how hard you try. You just can't get better at this. If we're talking about wagering, that argument is a little bit more nuanced, because it is technically possible, and there are very small numbers of people who are able to become professional gamblers through wagering products.
Well, that's the interesting thing, because entrepreneurs go, but I could be the Uber, and we're like, there's only one Uber, right?
Yeah.
And there's all the failures, and those people who get hooked up in it have these examples like, but there is this person who, wins millions of dollars on horses or something. And that's probably not quite accurate in exactly the same way. And who knows how else they make their wealth. But it's interesting. We have a narrative. We have really good reasoning. That's why that methodology, it's like, but there are Ubers of the world, or, there are the, horse trainers of the world. And it's like, they're not necessarily winning all their money just on races potentially.
Yeah, well, definitely horse trainers aren't making their money through gambling. I'll say that. But there definitely are people who do exist, and they're similar, in numbers to, the Ubers of the world, who have been able to use betting markets to their advantage and are professional gamblers. However, one, they are much smaller in number than people assume. And two, the process in which they go through is very different, and how they approach it is very different to, the 99.99% of people who gamble. And, I think that might be a bigger discussion for another day, but yeah, what they're doing is different in kind as opposed to different in a particular. It's not that, they must, and I think this is the mistake that most gamblers make, is they think, oh, well, maybe they're paying attention to who the trainer is and I need to pay attention to who the trainer is. Or maybe they're paying attention to the horse's last 5 starts or how much weight they're carrying. Or they think it's one particular feature of the horse race that they've got to pay attention to, so they can guess who's gonna win. Whereas what professionals gamblers are doing is, again, it comes back to probability, but they're looking at sort of the expected value of a bet, which is a very different way of working and a very different way of approaching it. Yeah, maybe a little bit beyond our discussion today, but yeah, it's more that, I guess that's the argument with wagering, is showing that if you want to succeed in this, what you've got to do is something that's different in kind. And it's something that's very difficult to do, that requires like an almost actuarial level understanding of mathematics that, the greater majority of the population just doesn't have.
What are the tools, strategies, perspectives that you have found have been most effective when working with clients in this? That and how what are the ways that you've assisted that the adoption, the understanding, the capacity to see what you're seeing, to assist clients to see that?
Yeah, and I think in some ways, if I was to put it in a phrase, it'd be something that's not too different from how you'd approach any, psychological problem. It's from, helping the client see the world for as it is and not how they want it to be, and helping them navigate that. And part of that is helping them understand and see all the sort of hidden assumptions, beliefs, things that are going on that are driving their behaviors and their emotional reactions that they're not aware of. So it's about providing them with awareness. And I guess part of that's helping them slow down. So, when someone's caught up with gambling, the same as when someone's anxious or depressed or has a problem with drugs and alcohol, it's almost, they go through these cycles of thoughts almost on autopilot. So it's about helping them slow down and say, hey, what are you thinking at this point? What are you thinking at that point? Is there another way you could look at this? Is there another way you can approach this? And teaching them that skill to sort of stop and think and reflect on what they're doing, what they're thinking at any one moment. I think that's, the general approach to gambling, as well as the general approach to, I'd say, pretty much anything that you're working with.
Very, very act like, at least the way that I'm hearing it, that obviously if someone's able to be a bit more mindful, slow down, pause, and therefore be a bit more considerate about, whether it's their thoughts, what their assumptions are, the beliefs that they're holding, see the world maybe as it is. So have some more data points, i.e., if you go out and actually record your winnings and losses and look at actual probabilities about, can you beat commercial gaming machines? And, notice your own sensations and feelings and so on. And then obviously some committed actions, and whether that is about, and values, my apologies, about why you want to even be doing that. Is it taking time away from your family? Is it eroding some relationships? Are there opportunities that you might be missing that are also meaningful and valuable to you? And is there something that you can do about that, or at least small steps?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, there's, as well as that, there's also elements, obviously, from what we're talking about of, more traditional, almost, Beckian cognitive work, focusing on, different thought traps that people can get caught in. There's, almost DBT-like elements focusing on, radical acceptance of the consequences of your previous actions. But it's not, I wouldn't call it eclectic, because it all comes from a unified place of what drives this behavior and what we've got to do to sort of focus on it. So it's about, I guess, bringing it to put it in a nutshell, in a few sentences, it's about one, highlighting how it's this focus on being up that's driving the behavior, and that people are discounting the probability of ending down. Then it's that thing that we spoke about of trying to take that step back, look at the bigger picture there, rather than focusing on the small picture. And then acceptance that, firstly, that gambling's not going to change. It's not all of a sudden going to turn into something where you can make huge amounts of money. And on top of that, acceptance of, the consequences of your actions, which can be financial primarily, or it can be on your relationships and whatnot. There's, I guess, the sort of steps generally of working with someone in this space.
Social policy. I mean, you work in this space, and you've seen obviously the harms and the like. What do you think would be useful? What would you contribute to social policy? Obviously, we pride ourselves with people having choice, and we know a lot of people enjoy gambling as a form of entertainment, and it can be fun for many. And then obviously there's this other part where, like anything, that there can be a destructive nature. Any thoughts, any contributions that you would have for, how do we do this as a nation even?
Look, it's a very broad question, and obviously there's different forms of gambling, and there's little tweaks here and there, as well as some big tweaks here and there with different forms of regulation around with gambling. But I think as a starting point, I think the thing that has to change first is a conceptualization of, and I think this is often how the public discourse goes from politicians, from the media, is that most people are fine with gambling, and then there's this small group of people who have a problem with gambling who need to be protected from it, but everyone else is fine. And that's not really what we see, and it's not how it works. There's really a continuum, and it's not that there's this unique group of people who are particularly vulnerable and everyone else is fine. Everyone has the potential to slip into gambling harms. Most of the processes driving gambling behavior aren't these majorly pathological thought patterns. They're, as we sort of described, thought patterns that are quite common and sometimes protective in other areas of life, that somehow get attached to this particular behavior, this particular activity that's leading to a negative outcome, as opposed to we're dealing with this small group of people who are somehow, diseased or pathological or something like that. So I think the narrative has to change to think about gambling harm as a continuum, as opposed to there being, this small subset of people who are harmed, who need to be protected, to realizing that there needs to be a range of interventions, a range of messaging, a range of ways of working that can address anyone that comes into contact with gambling. So through education campaigns, through limits on advertising and promotion, through counselling services for those who are at the pointier ends, support services, that way of focusing it on as a range, as opposed to more of a disease sort of way of looking at things.
And anything that you've seen from your work in terms of that's been particularly helpful for loved ones that are, observing, someone that they care about in this space, what's helpful from your perspective for them to be aware of, to know, to, how to, and obviously it's difficult to say in a broad sense, because it's much more nuanced in the therapy that you would be doing with the history and the like. But are there any broad sort of things that you could comment on?
I think working with family members, the main thing that helps for them is just for them to have someone listen to them and know that they're not alone, that this is not something that it's a problem that's unique to their family, and that there are people here to listen and support you who aren't going to judge you. I know that sounds like a bit glib, but, as we know, those sort of non-specific aspects of therapy are often sometimes the most important. Yeah. But on top of that, I think the elements that we work through with family members is really about protecting themselves through their loved ones gambling, and doing things, whether that's financially or psychologically, protecting themselves at the same time as helping them work through strategies to help support a person change their gambling behavior without necessarily issuing ultimatums and demands, which tend not to be particularly effective. And on top of that, making sure that people get the message that if someone does choose to continue to gamble, it's not your actions don't cause it, that you're not responsible for someone else's gambling, which can be in some ways empowering, but in some ways also disempowering, because if you can't control someone's gambling, it means you can't stop them either. So it's about information, support, and helping them protect themselves both psychologically and financially.
And once again, there's those challenges around language and meaning, control versus influence. And we're spot on. You cannot control, no one can control anyone, unless you're potentially incarcerated or something. And even that is to a degree. You then can't control what they might necessarily do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But, it can both have that, relief side of, I'm not contributing to this, but at the same time, it therefore means, I can't do anything about it. But we're back in the nuances and the reason why we love our work.
Yeah.
Where can people find out more, on this topic? Is there certain areas that you would suggest? How do we find out more about this theory of winning as well? That sounds fantastic.
Yeah. So generally, if people want support, help, further information in New South Wales, you can go to gambleaware.newsouthwales.gov.au, or there's a nationwide gambling support hotline, 1-800-858-858. For more information about some of those more specific aspects of gambling, there's definitely research articles on that. So we can maybe be in touch later about, and I can give you some details on some more specific resources and details on those sorts of things. But generally speaking, I think there's lots of information also available about how different forms of gambling work. So how poker machines work, how horses work, or how betting markets work. How horses work, that's more of a biological thing, I guess. So I guess all I would say to people is, if you're looking up this sort of information, just try and make sure you're getting it from a reputable source, whether it's a reputable source. So sometimes with YouTube, you can find things that, pay me $10 and I'll tell you the secret on how to make money on the poker machines and all these sorts of things. So, usually government-backed sources or university-backed sources are going to give people more reliable information on these sorts of topics.
Been extremely fascinating and so enjoyable to talk this through and, bounce these ideas and the nuances and also, this space around, whether it's randomness or probabilities or, how we develop ideas. And I think that word of, developing is really important, because it's not fully structured at the start, and over time we develop these maps that or enmeshment, of ideas that becomes very, very complicated. Before I let you go, I need to ask one more question, which is that a roulette wheel behind you? And how do you use that, if it is?
No, it is. It definitely is. So I always, so if someone was coming to my office, they'd see a roulette wheel. I've got a, dice here on the desk in front of me. I've got a little simulator poker machine, all sorts of things like that. So there's, we use demonstrations in the therapy room because it's important to get these concepts, people get their hands around the concept, so to speak. That is a roulette wheel.
Good clinical practice. I think doing exercises or activities definitely makes it stickier. It's lovely to see. That was great and really fascinating, because there's so many sort of cross points, but trying to kind of fit this into other theories and modalities, and although they're sometimes applicable, it's like, no, the data is not necessarily showing that. These are just theories and ideas. Like, you just put them together, right? You just make things up as you go.
Yeah, and I think that's
that's how we connect things. This is exactly how people develop beliefs.
Yeah, and I think that's it. It's sort of like, it's sort of what you some of the things you were describing is sort of like the sort of analogies to OCD, PTSD, drugs and alcohol. Like, lots of people have at various points in times that sometimes they've been the dominant ways of looking at things. So obviously the drug and alcohol framework is the dominant way of looking at things now. Prior to that, it was an OCD type framework and things like that. So I think, but it doesn't quite fit anything quite right. And so I think, while sometimes these models can be useful, they sometimes take you, there are differences enough that, you got to be mindful too of what as well.
It's just fascinating to watch how our brains work, saying, it's like that bias. I need to fit it in the information I've already got.
Yeah, and that's kind of how the theory of winning develops, essentially, if we're talking about
gambling. Exactly. Yeah.
Because it's sort of, you're trying to fit something which doesn't fit, like randomness, into our other ways of thinking about the world. So
love it. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, Chris, and your wonderful intelligence on this topic and the nuances. It's been so fascinating, and I've certainly got plenty out of it, and I'm sure the listeners will as well. So thank you so much for your time.
No problem at all.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.